All right, so opacity is kind of the natural follow-up to transparency. Okay, they kind of go hand in hand. So if you didn't watch lesson 4, you should probably go back and watch it, or at least you can open up lesson 5.psd and you can pick up where we left off, because I'm going to use the same image where we finished from lesson 4. All right, so opacity comes into play. When you click on a layer, if you look in the top right, you're going to see that there's an opacity setting up there, and I'll zoom in for you so you can see it. All right, that opacity setting means how much can you see through this layer, because even though, for example, the type layer, even though this layer is on the top of the layer stack, if I start to go to my opacity setting and bring that down, we're going to be able to see through it and see through the layers that are underneath it, inside of that layer stack. And we'll see through anything that intersects where this layer is. If you were to think about looking from the top down, you know, imagine this as like a overhead transparency. My college professors used to use them, those transparencies, and they used to stack transparency sheets on top of each other. Think of it like that. You're looking from the top down. Okay, and as I change the opacity, I can see through it. If I get all the way to the 0, it's almost like the layer's not there, even though it really still is. Okay, and that's where you get a lot of flexibility when it comes to using opacity. Now, one of the things that we can do here is actually start to bring in other images and change their opacity as well. So I've got a good demonstration here where if we bring in this pen that goes with the Wacom tablet, all right, so if I select all, copy, come into this image and paste this image in here, bring that image in. By the way, that's in lesson 5B, so make sure you open up all the images for this lesson. What I'm going to do is create kind of a fake drop shadow for this pen. All right, the way I can do that is if I hold down Command on Mac or Control on the PC and I click on that layer thumbnail, it's going to put a selection around it. I'm going to add a new layer on top of it, just a new blank layer. I'm going to set my foreground color to black and take my paint bucket tool and just click inside the pen. And let me zoom in so we can see this a little bit better. Click inside the pen and it fills it with black, and then I'll deselect. So now what I've got here is this black object. It's on its own layer. Remember, the pen's below it. I'm going to go up to the filter menu and blur this layer. Just go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, hit it with like a 6-pixel blur. What's nice about it is that since we're using layers, even though I ran a filter on this, it's not blurring the entire image. It's just blurring whatever layer I had selected. And now if I move it below the pen, take my move tool, move it down a little bit, offset it, you'll see the shadow's still a little bit too harsh. And that's where opacity comes in. I can bring that opacity down, and now it looks like a more realistic drop shadow. Okay, and I'll use the move tool, I'll bring it in just a little bit tighter. So that's one example, to create these shadows under your objects by using different filters combined with opacity. You can make things look more real. Let's go up here, lesson 5C. We've got some butterflies. Again, I'll copy and bring it into this image here. I'll paste them in. Move them up here toward the top right-hand side. And once again, I'm going to do the same thing I did before, and I'm going to bring my pen layer down with the other one. And just go to my butterflies, Command or Control click to put a selection, add a new layer, fill it with black like we did before, and deselect. And then I'm just going to run the same Gaussian blur filter. See, it blurs them, but if I drag it below, the original ones are still intact because all I did was blur the fake shadow layer. And then drop your opacity down. All right, and just like before, you can always move this around and kind of offset it just a little bit. And then the last one here, here's another object that we're going to copy. We're going to bring it into our other image here. We're going to paste it in and move it over toward the side. And notice what happens. It's all the way almost at the top of the layer stack. I'm going to bring it all the way up top. And notice it is going over some of the other layers. It hides those layers, but if I drop the opacity down, now I can start to see through it. And now I can make it more of a background image than something that was so distracting by having it bright and up front. So I can still have it to where the layer stack affects, look at where it is. It's on top of the text. I can still have it to where the layer stack will put it on top of the text because I like that effect. I just didn't want it to be so distracting when it was all white, so I dropped the opacity down. Which means we can still see it. The text does not go over it or cut it off or anything like that, but it's just less distracting. All right, a couple other things about opacity here. A lot of your tools have opacity. A perfect example would be the eraser tool. I kind of think the flowers in here, at least in the middle, are a little bit too distracting. I'm going to go down in the layers palette here, click on the flowers layer, and look up here when you have your eraser tool selected, you actually get an opacity slider. If it's at 100 and I erase, it erases everything, right? 100% opacity erases the whole thing. But if I undo and I drag this down to about 50%, now I get a more subtle effect. Now I can just erase parts. And the more I erase, the more times I keep clicking over this, the more I'm erasing the object. I'm kind of building the opacity downward instead of bringing it back up. So now I can feather these things in a little bit more subtly. And then there's another tool that comes in handy with opacity, and that is the gradient tool. Take a look at this shiny kind of effect that we have on that Wacom word right here. I'm going to put the same thing on the 101. So what we're going to do is let's select our lasso tool, and I'm very quickly just going to draw a wave. All right, just kind of think of it as a wave just like this, all right, just like that. And I'm going to bring it up around the top and bring it back with the original. Now, obviously this selection doesn't conform to the 101, and I want it to. So what we're going to do here is a little trick when it comes to selections. This really has nothing to do with layers, but it's a good trick for selections. And that is, I'm going to hold down Command Option Shift on Mac. All your keyboard modifiers, basically. So Command Option Shift on Mac, or Control Alt Shift on the PC. And then I'm going to click on the type layer here. See the 101 Wacom tips? I'm going to click on it and watch my selection when I click. See how it kind of intersects the selection to the text. So that's a little trick for you when you're making selections. You can go through and make it very big. All right, you don't have to try to be exact. I'm going to try to get it right again. I had it right a second ago, and that looks better. All right, so you don't have to make it exact, and then just hold down that keyboard shortcut and click on the layer, and now it conforms that selection to the layer. Let's go check out our gradient tool here. If you look up in your gradient picker, see the second gradient? It's called foreground to transparent. So if I set my foreground layer to white, and then I come up here and I click on that foreground to transparent gradient, use the linear gradient, and then just click and drag in this selection, we don't see anything. Why don't we see anything? Because I did it on the flowers layer, sorry. Let's go to that text layer and let's make a new layer on top of it to hold it. Now I'll click and drag. And you see what we get here? See how it goes from white at the top all the way to transparent. So it's like a fade. And then if I deselect and I drop that opacity down, I can do even more with it. Okay, so if you don't get it right the first time, I actually want to drag it down a little bit more. Yeah, there we go. And then drop my opacity down. That looks a lot better. And now I get almost that same shiny look that I had on the letter. So there's lots of different reasons you could use opacity. You could use it in graphic design like we are here. You can use it with photos by duplicating a layer of a person doing something on the duplicate layer, which we're going to do lots of in the rest of these videos, and then maybe changing the opacity to make the effect more subtle. So we're going to take a look at all kinds of stuff like that as we progress through the rest of the videos. But I do just want to make sure you have an introduction to what transparency and opacity are and how they work.